我马上就要教你怎么摆脱学习中文语法的困扰，并且不用拿起课本、请家教、上课，甚至不用下载任何应用程序就能掌握它。And no, I'm not going to tell you to, hey, just immerse and ignore grammar rules completely either. Instead, I'm going to share with you a unique approach that I picked up over a decade spent with this language. Hi, I'm Neale. I lived in China for over a decade, speak Mandarin fluently, and co-created Mandarin Blueprint to fix the broken Mandarin education system once and for all. Our online courses are helping thousands of members every day reach advanced Chinese in a fraction of the time. So, to teach you about how to acquire grammar in the best way possible, let me tell you about my story first. So when I started learning Chinese, I approached grammar in the same way that I did when I was in high school learning French. I don't speak French, by the way, which is indicative of how effective those methods actually are. But I started off using some textbooks and teachers, found that I couldn't string a sentence together. And then I thought to myself, well, the traditional method doesn't seem to be working. I'm not really learning many words. My grammar is a complete mess. I can't express myself. I can't really understand much. So what I'll do is go for the more modern approach. I'll go to websites and apps and start learning about flashcards and start using those every day. I found a website called memrise.com. I built up 16.5 million points on this website, memorizing thousands and thousands of words. And I did that based on a definition. So I would just look at the word without learning the characters, without really seeing it in any context whatsoever. And I would just memorize the English definition. And I did this for thousands of words. I think it's 9,000 or so. And after doing this for several months at around 2 or 3 hours a day, I realized at the end of that, by this point, I was about a year into my study, that I couldn't really express myself any better than when I started. I knew a lot of words. Technically, they were floating around in my head somewhere, but I just couldn't use them. And when I would try to use them, I would just get laughed at by my Chinese friends. So then I thought logically, well, I know all these words. I actually don't, but I thought I know all these words. And my issue is I don't know how to use them. I don't know how they behave in a sentence. So what I'm missing is grammar, an understanding of grammar. So I then found a website called Chinese Grammar Wiki. And I spent 2 months going through every grammar point on this entire website, all the way from A1 to C1 grammar points. Everything they had, writing them out one by one, writing notes about them, trying to consciously understand grammar. And needless to say, another 2 months of that was also pretty much a waste of time. It didn't help me whatsoever. Although it felt satisfying and it was interesting, I was fascinated in the language and I wanted to study how it worked. It felt good, but it wasn't actually getting me to my result. It wasn't actually making me more fluent, wasn't helping me have conversations, wasn't helping me understand anything any better. By this point, the honeymoon phase for Chinese was starting to wear off. I'd come to China at that point to learn Chinese, and I realized that I'd spent over a year now really trying. I'd genuinely worked to learn this language, and I was just not very good at it at all. So I was around 25 at this point, and I had what I like to call a quarter-life crisis. I had flown halfway around the world to learn a language of a culture that I was fascinated with since I was in my early teens. And a lot of my friends were becoming investment bankers, surgeons, that kind of thing. And I was doing a job that I didn't like. I was teaching English, trying to get by. And this pursuit of learning Chinese was the thing that I was going to use to sort of stand out and become different. And it just wasn't working out at all. At this point, I was genuinely considering heading home until I stumbled across this video by Dr. Stephen Krashen. He talked about comprehensible input. So essentially the idea of getting content, whether that's messages in the form of reading or listening or watching TV or whatever it is, some sort of content that you can understand into your brain, immersing in the language. And that is the only way to acquire language. And at this point, I thought, well, that's not what I've been doing at all. I've been learning grammar consciously. I've been memorizing lists of words, being incredibly bored and not really immersing myself in the language whatsoever. And then I confirmed this by researching what the polyglots have to say, people that professionally learn language. Essentially, they learn many languages, they speak many languages. I started following what they said, and they all, although they had slightly different approaches, they all tend to follow this comprehensible input idea to some degree. And I thought, there it is. So I started learning how to read. By this point, I hadn't learned really a single character properly. So I learned 3,000 characters in 6 months. I did that by using memory palaces, but that's in another video. So after I learned Chinese characters, I started reading Chinese sentences and reviewing those in my flashcards every single day, and also dipping my toe into immersion, actually watching Chinese TV, starting to listen to Chinese audiobooks, podcasts, this kind of thing, and graded readers, anything I can get my hands on really. And very quickly, like in a period of a few weeks to a few months, I noticed a stark difference in my ability to accurately produce the language, and I started to understand it. It was almost as if like these words that I built up in my head, these thousands of words that I didn't know how to use, they were just sort of random, and there were lots of words that seemed very similar or had the same definition that I didn't know how to separate in my mind and what the differences actually were. These subtle differences, this ability to use the language, started just to become second nature. It's like a subconscious understanding of the language that started to build up. So then I would say another few months later, so around about total of 2 years, so a year after I'd almost given up on the language entirely, I had achieved approximately B2 level fluency, and I also passed the HSK 6, which was the highest level Chinese exam at the time. So I used my conscious brain at first to try and learn Chinese grammar and understand it consciously, and that was just not working whatsoever. And then once I switched to subconscious acquisition of the language through immersion, the grammar started to become second nature. And this makes sense logically, right? I mean, what grammar book did you use? What class did you attend to speak your native language fluently, whatever that is? It wasn't any book that you used, right? You just sort of naturally consumed the language, practiced it by trying to speak it, and then consuming it a bit more. And then eventually you learned to read and really took your language to the next level when you were around like 7, 8, 9 years old. And that's kind of how language acquisition goes for everyone, right? Take a look at this sentence for a second and tell me, is it correct or incorrect? You know it's incorrect, right? Now, you may not know why unless you're a trained English teacher. You probably can't tell me why it's wrong, what rule has been broken, and nor do you really need to. You may not know which grammar rule is broken, but you know 100% it's wrong and how to say it correctly. You've consumed thousands of hours of input in English, and you've heard of the structure, I saw thing or person in the past, whatever time, yesterday or last week. I saw John yesterday. You've seen that, heard that structure many, many times, thousands of times, and never once was the word seen used in that context. It was only ever saw. So your brain instantly and subconsciously tells you, that's wrong, because it's not the way these words behave according to the data that I've collected over my years with this language. So really, if you want to develop a native-like sense for how Chinese words are used, i.e. grammar, then the key is to build that data up by getting lots of comprehensible input. So does that mean that studying grammar, like looking at grammar rules, thinking about grammar consciously, is a complete waste of time? Well, I went back and forth on this topic a lot over the years, and my answer is no. Consciously studying grammar rules, while not strictly necessary, does have its place as long as you do it in the right way so that your ROI or return on investment is high, i.e. not how I did it in my first year of learning. So here's when you shouldn't bother with consciously learning grammar. The first situation is when it's really simple stuff, straightforward Chinese grammar. So a lot of Chinese grammar is super simple and easy to understand, so you never really need to study it. So for example, the fact that there's no verb conjugations, it's not I go, he went, or they go, he goes. There's none of that. It's just chu, go, in any situation, and it doesn't change at all. Nothing changes based on tense or the person speaking or the number of the thing, so it's single or multiple. There's no female or male, there's no genders within the language. So this kind of stuff, it is weird at first, but you just kind of pick it up naturally as you see example sentences. All that, as well as simple sentences in Chinese, like short sentences, tend to follow just the simple subject, verb, object. I love you, 我爱你. All this stuff, you don't need to study it because it's just so simple after just immersing in the language just a little bit. Now, another low ROI situation where it's not worth learning grammar consciously for Chinese is when the sentences are really complex, or you're trying to understand when certain words are placed in the sentence in longer sentences. So for example, I eat breakfast at 7 a.m. in Chinese is 我早上7点吃早餐. I, morning, 7 o'clock, eat breakfast. This is the kind of thing that if you try and study it consciously, you're going to go crazy. All right. The best thing is just to, again, consume the language and not try and learn it, and just consume. And after enough sentences, whether individuals, example sentences, through flashcards or through, consuming the language naturally, you will pick this up. Instead of trying to look at grammar equations, as I call them, this plus this equals this, you should rely on the awesome power of your subconscious mind to get this with enough exposure. Another thing I do not recommend you spend a lot of time doing, unless it's just purely out of interest, is trying to understand the various different usages of certain words or characters. So there are many words, of course, in Chinese that just have a single meaning, that's all. So 车 or 汽车 is car, and it's not really got any nuance to it, it's just car. But there are other words like 就 or 过 or 了 that can be used in different ways depending on the context. And some of our members on our courses, often what they'll do is that when they come across one of these words, like 就, for example, is a big one, because you look at that in the dictionary and it literally has like 6 or 7 definitions depending on how it's used. And what a lot of our members will do is like, okay, I've just learned one definition, I'm going to learn the other 6 now, and try to look at example sentences and try and master this word in one go. You will naturally build on your foundational understanding of that word through exposure to different example sentences, different contexts, through TV shows, content, natural conversation with native speakers. You'll do this over time. Also, it's very likely that, let's say if there are, say, 5 or 6 different usages of a single character or word, that one of those is super common compared to the rest, and 1 or 2 or perhaps all of them, or all of the remaining definitions or usages are super uncommon, relatively speaking. And you'll come across these different usages while you're consuming the language, and you'll be able to pick up these other usages and nuances over time. So when is it okay to learn grammar consciously? Well, I think that there are certain words that do provide a ton of confusion for learners for a long time and give us tons of frustration and ambiguity. But how they work to a large degree can be figured out consciously within a few minutes by just asking a tutor or referring to, say, ChatGPT, or looking up a video on YouTube about how this grammatical function works, and then consuming a bunch of example sentences. This is quite high ROI if you think about it. A good example of this is the character le, which can confuse learners when we are starting out. And I'm sure you know what I'm talking about if you've learned Chinese. This character is confusing because it has multiple functions and uses that can be context dependent. So often, le is confused with being solely indicating the past tense, for example, but its primary function is to show a completion or change. So you'll see it in sentences like 我吃饭了, I ate le. And that le, you might think, that's indicating the past. So if I ever want to say something has happened in the past tense, I'll just say le. Then you might start seeing le in the present tense. 下雨了, it's raining, or it's just started raining. Or even the future tense, 要下雨了. And that might confuse you. But then you might start hearing it doubled up in a sentence. So quickly, 2 le's, one after the other. 我睡了1个小时了. And what does that mean? And this can confuse you for a long time. And because generally speaking, most learners only have an hour or 2 to study each day, you don't get that much exposure. So it might take you a long time to figure this sort of ambiguity out, and thoughts might start creeping in like, I'm just not very good at languages. Why don't I get this? I'm not very smart, that kind of thing. And just to avoid that, you can watch a single video or read a single article about le, and consciously things will become clear almost instantly. And you might not be able to immediately use le in conversation just by having watched a YouTube video or consciously learning about the rules behind it. But that ambiguity, that frustration is dramatically reduced, and it gives you more excitement to see that le in context when you're immersing or when you're learning. So I think it's absolutely fine to look up stuff, especially when you've seen something that really throws you for a loop. You're like, wait a minute, I thought this word was used this way. Now it's being used this way. What the heck's going on in this sentence? If that goes on for any period of time and it's starting to bother you, go ahead and dive in for a few minutes and look up how this word is used. Not only will this make you feel better and maybe give you a more motivation and confidence, but it may well help you notice this word in immersion or in conversation more and be able to master it quicker. So make it part of your subconscious active vocabulary faster than you would have if you hadn't looked it up. However, another word of caution on this, there is always a point where the ROI is lowered to such a point where it's no longer worth spending the time, no matter what grammatical function you're trying to get to grips with. For example, with le again, you may quickly understand that it indicates a change of state or completion. 我吃饭了. Okay, I get that. But then maybe you see it used in a way that throws you for a loop again. 我吃过饭了. Why is the 过 there? 我吃了饭. Hang on a minute. They changed the position of 吃饭了 to 吃了饭. Why did they do that? And you will have questions. Why is that happening? Why is that there? And maybe you ask ChatGPT, and then maybe you try and search on Google, and then you try and maybe search on YouTube, and you still don't really get it. So you ask a tutor, or you start asking us questions on our course platform. And at this point, what we start telling our members who ask lots and lots of grammar questions is, although we answer them and we say, yes, it's like this, we always start adding the point of, by the way, this is not the best way to spend your time right now. You've gone too deep down this rabbit hole, and it's best instead to spend your time working through the course, continuing to immerse in the language, start seeing this word more in different contexts, and eventually it will become obvious how it works. Being okay with not understanding is an important skill that we have to develop. Most of us don't have it. And continually satisfying your curiosity and consciously trying to figure everything out that confuses you, at the end of the day, I feel it's tantamount to just staying in your comfort zone. It's ego even at a certain point, taking yourself seriously to the point where you think, I must understand everything. But it's stepping outside of your comfort zone and tolerating that ambiguity where we improve the most. Overly focusing on grammar turns language acquisition into linguistics. You stop acquiring and you start learning about Chinese, which is not your goal. Your goal is to speak Chinese fluently. To quote Katsumoto of All Japanese All the Time, one of my favorite language learning gurus, I guess you could say, you don't need to understand biochemistry to eat a sandwich. In our curriculum, the Blueprint, here's how we handle this problem of balancing conscious learning with subconscious acquisition when it comes to grammar. As you build up your characters and words, you'll start to see example sentences made up of those characters and words you already know. Now, we only present grammar lessons or explanations of particular words or structures after we know that you've already seen these particular words or structures in context at least 10 times. Now, when we start talking about how the word de or le functions, it's not teaching you how it works necessarily. It's just merely to eliminate any confusion that you may have felt up to this point. And it's to give you that idea of, oh, I already know this, and now you're explaining it consciously. That makes me feel really good. And by the way, these lessons are totally optional. You can just skip them. Now, once you have learned a decent amount of Chinese, around HSK 3 to 4 intermediate stage, you should forget about studying grammar entirely and focus exclusively on getting enough input. Some of us enjoy a bit of conscious study, but it's only useful if you keep it in check and use it as a tool to get to the point where you understand the language subconsciously. And it never replaces getting plenty of input and enjoying the journey. Aim to balance conscious learning with extensive input and practice, and learn to accept and let go of the things you don't yet understand. Do this and you won't struggle with Chinese grammar ever again.